I often say thank you for the Sam prayers. Thank you for the Brother Randy prayer. Appreciate it. And everybody, welcome. Hope everybody having a good day so far. Welcome back to everybody who has been traveling and whatnot. We got a few folks coming through the door right now, so I'll wait before I start really rambling and whatnot. But first question is going to be, where in the set of chapters for this week would you like to start? What came to mind for you? There are a number of topics we can deal with. If anything came to mind, let's just start there. First question, of course, would be, where are we?
Ezekiel 17.
Close?
13 through 19.
13 through 19. So I'm guessing 17 caught somebody's attention. Yeah, maybe?
18 caught mine, but I don't know where you want to start.
18 is kind of what caught my attention. It's almost like the last thing that was on my mind while I was studying this week. 18 caught my attention quite a bit as I was going through things one more time. So 18 seems like a good destination. Anywhere else, or any themes or things that came to mind in thinking about the chapter this week? Or chapters? All right, I'll tell you what they kind of brought to mind. One of my, I won't say favorite teachers. He wasn't a teacher at Sunset by the time I got there, but I got a chance because he was still nearby to hear him teach a lot. And he was big on chapter themes. And so for whatever reason, this week it seemed to stand out to me in chapter themes. So as I was just jotting notes down, I'll tell you what came to mind in each chapter. Chapter 13, of course, was talking about two brands of false prophets. We've never heard that before, right? Okay, so he's hitting the false prophets again. Chapter 14, as we talked about it is really helpful when the elders set an environment where we can talk openly about the difficulties that they were facing in the leadership back here. Because chapter 14 is going to talk about the false prophets and the elders and the accountability that he is holding the nation to together. Chapter 15, it's kind of, for whatever reason, the concept of good fruit stood out to me, and I can't remember why good fruit. Oh, that's right, because it's literally talking about a useless vine, And so the whole concept of 8 verses, a very short chapter talking about a useless vine, reminded me of what Jesus talks about in John 15, where he says, he is the vine, and his Father is the vine dresser. Who remembers what he says? Every branch in him that produces good fruit. What's his Father's response? What's God's response to branches that actually are productive?
He'll trim them or
That's it. He'll prune them, right? And so pruning, when you say trim, that means what? He's
shaping them or
shaping by how? By what?
But, well, in that instance, it would be cutting. So in our instance, it would be trial.
That's right, okay? So even when we're doing well, it's kind of like the Hebrew writer, I think, says, no discipline seems fun at the time, right? And so a lot of times when we're getting disciplined, it's kind of like, I guess I talked a little bit about on Sunday. It's like, why are things going so well over there when I thought I was doing what was right? Literally, Psalm 73, one of my favorite Psalms, the psalmist describes himself as, I was brutish towards God, because it seemed like every day I was getting up, he was hitting me with something. It wasn't like in Job where it seemed like it was God, but it was really the devil. He's like, it was really God doing the whacking every time I seemed to get up. And it seemed like it would be better just not to be working for him at all, right? And so in a lot of ways, I'm getting really amped up, right? But that's a lot of ways what we see in chapter 15. It's that whole concept of it's better to have his attention than to not have it at all. Because in chapter 15, he's talking about how the entire city has become so useless, he's about to get rid of them. So good fruit is what I thought about, because that's the metaphor he uses. Chapter 16, it's kind of like, it's one of those awkward passages, because has anybody looked through 16 yet? Just give me an idea. What are some of the most awkward biblical metaphors that come to mind? Most awkward biblical metaphors that come to mind when you think of the Bible?
He talks about lewdness and abominations, but he also talks about them being morally unfaithful.
You're dressing up, brother. We are on record, right?
Yeah.
What's the metaphor he actually used? Oh, we do have a young person coming in now.
Adulterous?
Yeah, well, you call it adultery. What's that? Let's just call it, yeah, let's use the nice word for it.
King James didn't use it as well.
Yeah. He used the word that we more commonly use, and the ESV does. I let the tape run a little bit longer today because I was running late as usual. And the last chapter we got to, I think, was chapter 23, and it gets even worse in chapter 23. But in chapter 16, he's using that metaphor over and over again for the descent or the decline in his relationship between himself as God and the people of Israel. He's calling them the over and over again in the second half of the chapter. But what's the distinction? What's the distinction in their brand of harlotry? How does that usually work? In prostitution stings, maybe out on a stroll, out in Seattle. Why are police busting prostitutes? It's because they offer a service for money. But who's getting paid in chapter 16?
God says Israel is paying.
They're literally paying people to come in and help them do adulterous things, right? And so it said it's not just a twisted concept, it's a completely twisted economy. And so it's that picture of, in the modern, the young people's language, they call it being thirsty. So it's super thirsty. It's so thirsty, you're skipping past what you could usually get for your services. You're devaluing yourself so much. You're so thirsty that you just want the attention that you can get. And part of it says they're actually becoming famous for it. And so it's one thing to have, everybody has we have self-esteem. And self-esteem is healthy. We have to be very careful in how we feed our self-esteem. Because if we want any kind of attention whatsoever, we can find ourselves acting super thirsty just to fill our self-esteem. Even if it's being known for something that's completely ridiculous. And that's what he's bringing out in chapter 16. How ridiculous they've become in their search for whatever it is that they are looking for. In chapter 17 and 18, I just described in terms of accountability. And now we're approaching the chapter that caught your attention. And so 17 started that whole concept of accountability for me because we've talked about going back to the leadership concept, even beyond official titles in the body of Christ, whether it's preacher, elder, whatever. What are some of the responsibilities that go along with leadership that would relate to accountability? What are some of the responsibilities that go along with leadership? Go ahead.
One of the things that always struck me about leadership is you're accountable for what your followers do, keeping them straight.
Did you read the chapter? You read the chapter already? That's literally where we're going, right? But that's where we're going. If you want to just jump with me to maybe verse 21 might be good to get some. No, verse 21 will get it. It won't be great context, but it's the first half of it was completely confusing for me. And this is one where I was really glad that he gave the interpretation because he's talking about two eagles and a vine. This isn't one I was familiar with. I'd heard about it before, but because it was confusing before, I just avoided it. And so I was like, okay, I guess I've got to study it now. So it still wasn't much more clear until he gave the explanation that in the second half of the chapter, verses 11 through the end of the chapter, he's basically talking about both nations or two nations. He has given them over in the hands, as we've heard at this point, of the Babylonians. That's one of the eagles. It's going to take the top of a cedar and plant it somewhere else. And it's actually going to sprout and do well. It's talking about what seems to be the remnant, right? But he's going to say there's another eagle. And that eagle is going to represent Egypt. And that eagle is going to represent a broken covenant. Because what's happened is they know they are their own nation, but they don't like where they've gotten themselves under Babylonian supervision. Because right now it's just supervision. It was invasion. It was going to be absolute servitude. But God, through Nebuchadnezzar, cut them a break and left most of them in the nation under the condition that they not rebel, which is exactly what they do, which represents the second eagle. So instead of abiding by their covenant with Nebuchadnezzar to offer tribute and simply be one of his subjects, they run to Egypt to say, help us get our independence from this guy over here. And what God is going to do is break the bad news to them. You were contracting with Nebuchadnezzar, but you were really contracting with me. And so it's much like when you see in Matthew 25, when he says, as much as you did it to the least of them, you did it to me. It's not always the least of these. Here, it's a king who is literally standing in the place of God. And when they thought they were disrespecting the king, they were really disrespecting the king all over again in a completely different way. And so the reason that matters is he is going to hold them additionally accountable, not only for their sins, but for breaking covenant, not with a man, but breaking covenant with God. And the reason why that's important is we talked about this whole concept of, we went back to Diddy. The whole Diddy thing was, it was a situation where he ended up creating his own empire, right? But how do we say that ended up catching up with him? In a situation where a lot of times rich folks just get out of jail. How did it catch up to him in unsuspecting or unusual ways?
That's because his pride, he thought he could get away with anything, so he started being openly with his actions. Yeah. You know, and rubbing his nose, and you see rubbing his nose places, thinking that they were buy him out instead, you know.
And over time, it's what we talked about in terms of swallowing the hook. When sin becomes fun, it becomes super dangerous. Because when we talked about your source of self-esteem is where the counselors will step in and they will say, one of the things that, I want to get too far off in the counseling piece, but I do like when the counseling overlaps with the Bible. Because they will tell you that one of the things that becomes super dangerous is when your source of self-esteem is tied up into doing wrong. And so your endorphins are actually triggered by lying or pulling something over on people. And so that's what happened with Diddy. He began to actually find it fun to do wrong. And so as long as he had the protection of whoever was protecting him, it was good. But once that protection was gone, all that fun was basically, in our normal language, those are crimes. It's not just sin, they're crimes. And so that's what happened. And so over the years, he was stacking up this whole stack of crimes that created a pile that he couldn't bail out of. And so that's the problem that you're seeing here in Israel, is they're getting used to doing what they want for so long that they're forgetting that the consequences, they're forgetting the consequences at all because they're used to getting away with it. And so ultimately, the danger is, I'm sorry, brother, when I get in the habit, I'll just use me as an example, of crossing boundaries, sometimes when I stop asking whose boundaries am I crossing, sometimes I end up on the property of somebody who's really a whole lot more than what I'm used to dealing with. And that's the problem that you're seeing here. They're getting into the habit of crossing boundaries, and now they've stepped over a boundary line they really didn't know was as crucial as it was. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. They're openly sin. They're not even hiding their sin no more. And that's the same thing with Diddy. He's not hiding it. You know, he's slapping people with haters. They're so egotistical. They're blind to how open their sin is and stuff. That's the way the country of Israel was.
That's it. And so that ties to what New Testament concept that we talk about from time to time. Why is that relevant? Why is this more than just an old covenant thing? Why does that matter today for New Testament Christians?
If you have no humility, you will not be following what God has told you to do. You can't learn, you can't do much of anything.
No humility? What else? Go ahead.
Well, these folks, they went so far and sinned so many times and in such horrible ways as that they became an abomination to God. Abomination means disgusting and horrible. If you become something disgusting and horrible to God, what can you expect to get? And we have to be careful not to fall into that trap.
Amen. How is it that they became an abomination or disgusting and horrible, though? That's the word I'm looking for that ties the Old Testament or these stories to what we are as New Testament Christians. There's a word it's a subtle thing, but it's a word that God uses over and over again in the New Testament. Go ahead.
Well, they did so many things, worshiping false gods, bringing the false idols into the temple, actually having prostitutes in the temple, selling, animals at the temple for sacrifices. They did a lot of stuff.
Now, by the time we get to the New Testament, a lot of that's just old school now, right? They're not doing a lot of it. They're still doing the temple prostitution. But most of that stuff they don't care about anymore. It's beneath them to actually worship idols like they used to. It's kind of more low key. What's the word, though, that ties the New Testament version of what they're doing to all the things you just mentioned? Disobedience, but it's a kind of disobedience that it's almost like we say the pandemic. It's disobedience scaled into pandemic form. When you get home, I know all the words I ask you to look up lawlessness. Lawlessness is a word that comes up over and over again, and it's going to factor heavily into what God is literally coming back to deal with. And so if you want to look up any word from tonight, the word that connects all these Old Testament stories, these 7 chapters that we're dealing with right now, to things that matter to us, and not just us, but our generations going forward, is lawlessness. Because it literally says that's what he's coming back to deal with. And so that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing people who are you're going past just getting into the habit of sinning. By the time we get to the chapters next week, he's going to talk about they're doing all kinds of abominations, things that just God and the people around them find disgusting. And we passed by the chapters, I didn't really emphasize it, but it's that whole difference. Like I talk so much about the difference between personality and character. One of the reasons why in Lamentations chapter 1, they become disgusting to the neighbors and the people around them is once he lifts the veil off of what they've been doing. It's another one of those metaphors where he says once he pulls back their skirt, he literally says, and the people get to see what's actually been going on in Israel, they become disgusting to everybody around them, right? And that's tied to lawlessness. And so it's going beyond simply getting into the habit of doing things to having your self-esteem, your adrenaline comes from doing wrong, to the point where you're now spinning off into some things that are so strange that you're trusting in the image, but behind the image, it's all dependent upon people never really seeing what's going on, because once they do, it gets real ugly. All right, I've strayed and I've rambled, but I'm sorry, Baba. All right, verse 21 though. Verse 21 is where our brother led us to, because that is the question of what happens in leadership. Why is leadership so important, or what distinguishes leadership from just everyday judgment that we can make in our private personal lives? Who wants to read chapter 17, verse 21? Verse 21.
And all the pick of his fruit shall fall by the sword, and the survivors shall be scattered to every wind. And you shall know that I am the Lord, I have spoken.
Who has a different translation for all the pick of his troops? What's that? What's a different translation? Go ahead.
I have all his fugitives.
Oh, it's fugitives, really?
I know his fugitives and his bands.
Fugitives and his bands. Anything else? Any other translations? Nothing? Nothing?
All his troops.
All his troops?
Fugitives and all his troops.
Fugitives and troops? Okay. The reason why this passage caught my attention is because when you see the actual history of Israel and Judah going off into captivity in phases, their decline, much like we see Nebuchadnezzar taking them off in stages, it happens slowly. So how do we get here from the days when under David, they have whole chapters devoted to a group of men called the mighty men, the mighty men. Who remembers the chapters devoted to David's mighty men?
I don't remember exactly the chapters, but I remember the context of them.
And what's some of the things you remember about the mighty men? What are some of the cool, how did they become the mighty men? They just got picked, they were favorites, or what happened?
The feats of in battle.
Yeah. So you got one guy or single individuals, go ahead.
Bravery.
And bravery.
And their loyalty.
Bravery and loyalty to David, God willing, and even to Saul. And that's what's going to be important. The loyalty is going to be super huge. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, even with David, he at first as a leader, he went out and he fought with the troops and everything like that. He led the troops. And when he messed up, it was when he sat back and let everyone else do, the fighting
That's
for
it.
him and stuff. And that's when he,
Bathsheba.
yeah.
That's it. All right. So what was talk to me a little bit about the history of the mighty men. They just kind of all rode off into the sunset, and that was it. Happily ever after. Slay dragons, move on. Oh, what happened was reality. So I can't tell you what happened to all of David's mighty men, but he did get to pass them off to Solomon. However, in my understanding, the history of the mighty men gets murky around the time you have the split in the kingdom between north and south. And what ends up happening is you still see that phrase come up every now and again about mighty men. But what you'll start to see is situations like this in verse 21, where it says, all the pick of his troops shall fall by the sword. Ultimately, when they start getting off into battles that they don't need to be fighting, not everybody comes home. And it's not a situation where all the bad troops get killed, because sometimes the mighty men are the most courageous. They're the ones who are going to run out to save a buddy who might not be as good a soldier. And so they're going to put themselves in situations where they're the ones that actually gets killed. Remember when 3 guys, just so David could have a drink of water, they were going to cross enemy lines, and they did. Just to give him a drink of water because it seemed like he was having a rough day. That's the kind of thing some of the mighty men do. And under the days of David, when they had God's blessing, he's looking out for them. But guess what? You mentioned Bathsheba. Who was one of the mighty men?
Her husband.
Uriah. And so it's not a fairy tale. Sin gets the might. What's that going? I'm sorry.
and they abandoned him in battle. They got him, so he was fighting on the front lines, and they just drew back from him. Let him get killed.
And that's what happens with the mighty men. When the rest of them were fleeing, you think he wasn't thinking about turning around.
Right.
He wasn't in on the scheme. He did what the mighty men do, fight.
Right.
And that's what got him killed. It was shiesty choices by the king. And so it's not just in that situation. David was still, even though he was simply trying to cover his sin, he got one of his most, and that was the irony, is David ended up doing the same thing to Uriah that Saul was trying to do to him. Right? So that's the irony of that situation. And so that's one of the reasons why the sin was so great. And so when Nathan told the story, he really told it from that perspective. He told it from his perspective of a guy, I mean, this guy, all he's got is his ewe lamb. And this guy, telling him it was the king, got himself into a situation where he just took whatever this loyal soldier had. All right, I'm giving far afield again, but the bottom line is, under David, it was just Uriah, right? They had some others that got killed because Joab was notoriously hot-headed, or anytime he saw somebody coming up that was possibly going to replace him because he got himself in a whole lot of trouble, he was killing all the rivals, right? And so in the course of killing all his rivals, he got one of his brothers killed, right? And so that was another one of the mighty men who fell. And so that was one of the things that we're seeing in David's day. You're seeing that even great leaders, because Joab was still a great military leader, but he got one of his own brothers killed going too far too fast, and David got one of his own mighty men killed. It just gets worse under the kings that were more myopic and self-absorbed. And so these mighty men, like we're seeing in chapter 17, they're not coming home from these battles when God is not with them. And so no matter how mighty they are, when you go look at those chapters on the mighty men, you get a better feel for it just on the level of courage. You know, a lot of times, sometimes I go off on one of my rants because, the last time I went off about, school shooters. We're in a society now where it's considered cool to shoot a bunch of unarmed people with a gun. We are completely flipped from what cool used to be. See, cool used to be one guy standing against a troop with a spear, or one guy going down against a guy the size of Goliath, taking his weapon and killing him with it. Or one guy, and that's how these guys became the mighty men. They stood up against, sometimes unarmed, against people who were armed, and they handled business, as we would call it, right? But now we're starting to hand out stripes for what used to be cowardice. So let me calm down, right? But that's literally how far afield we've come as a society, right? And so that's what we're seeing here. Once a society begins to lose these guys, they don't regenerate, they don't respawn. It's not like in a video game. Well, I used to be big in a video game. I get shot, I'll go respawn. I got wounded. No, in real life, no. That's not how it works. And so they're making decisions that are getting the mighty men killed, and it's marking the decline of the nation as these guys aren't coming home from battle, right? And so that's chapter 17. That was one of the things that just stood out to me in chapter 17. And so that's the whole concept of accountability. In leadership, one of the reasons why I asked that question is in leadership, my decisions, we've said it before, it's a sub thing. They don't just affect me, they affect other people. I just thought about it today. When I'm catching myself making mistakes to the degree that these videos live on, it's one thing for me to say something that goes far afield of what the word says. I'm just, oops! But not everybody catches the oops video. And so I get a little bit nervous when I start putting it in perspective and I think of how many oopses am I not catching, right? That somebody might take and run with. And if I state in my opinion as if it's a fact and somebody else takes that and it becomes a doctrine, God's holding me, I don't even want to say holding me accountable for that, but he is. Right? Teachers are under stricter judgment, right? And so it's more sobering then. So no matter how big the following can possibly get, at the end of the day, you don't really realize how many serious material errors you're weaving in, you're sending out into the world that you may never get back. You don't know who's watching what video, who's listening to what thing, and it's sticking with them a different way, right? And so that's a sobering thought. Why? Because by the time, let's back up a little bit. One of those, since I'm off on one right now. When he's holding, okay, it was frightening enough when he told Ezekiel, if you don't warn them, I'm going to hold you accountable for the ones that died. I thought that was bad until this one.
Watchman, yeah.
Right? The famous Watchman passage. That one didn't scare me half as much as this one. Back in chapter 14, we was talking about he was going at the elders and the prophets. Who wants to read verses 6, maybe through roughly, maybe through 9. You can read it through to 11 if you want, but 6 through 9 at least, please.
14.
In chapter 14, yeah.
Therefore, say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord, repent, turn away from your idols, and turn your faces away from your abomination. For anyone of the house of Israel, or of the strangers who dwell in Israel, who separates himself from me, and sets up his idols in his heart, and puts before him what causes him to stumble into iniquity, and he comes to a prophet to inquire of him concerning me, I, the Lord, will answer him by myself. I will set my face against the man and make him a sign and a proverb. I will cut him off from the midst of my people. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. You want me to keep going?
Please.
And if the prophet is induced, and if the prophet is induced to speak anything, I, the Lord, have induced that prophet. And I will stretch out my hand against him and destroy him from among my people of Israel. And they shall bear the iniquity of the punishment of the prophet, shall be the same as the punishment of the one who acquired.
Who, back in verse 9, who has a different word for, or just give me a different translation on that verse, please. And if the prophet,
When he is enticed and has spoken a word,
go ahead.
I, Jehovah, I have enticed that prophet, and have stretched out my hand against him, and have destroyed him from the midst of my people Israel.
Please give me another translation of verse 9.
Deceived.
You know what I'm looking for.
Prevail.
Induce, deceive. And who did the deceiving?
God. Because God is like, God is casting him. So, if they talk, they're not, because he's warning them, don't say anything, because if someone is that type of caliber person comes and asks him, you don't say anything, I'm going to take care of him.
I'm gonna literally read what the ESV says. And if the prophet is deceived and speaks a word, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet. I'm not getting into the theology that God is not gonna lie. He's not gonna tempt anyone to sin. Like you said, I love the word you use, test. He will test you. He's not gonna tempt anybody to sin. We talked about this before. We're in a world of hurt when God becomes our enemy. And so that is what I'm seeing here, specifically from a preacher's perspective. It terrifies me because I'm not I try to fool me, God. Good one. That's not happening. If God wants me fooled, that's a wrap, bud. That's a wrap, right? And so I told you, I didn't even want the judgment I was under before I decided whether or not I was going to preaching school. I did not want this smoke, as we say it now, right? I didn't want that. But you don't get a chance to back away from the opportunities that God gives you either, because there are consequences there as well. So what's distinguishing the prophets who are literally now being deceived by God, if they got this translation right, from Ezekiel? And why is he not passing out all over again? Like, oh my, right? Because I'm reading it, I'm having a moment when I'm going through this, right? Why is Ezekiel not trembling? Why is Ezekiel not trembling? Go ahead.
If we go on in the chapter, we get down to verses 13 and 14. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite verses from the Old Testament.
Go ahead.
13, Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, and cut off from it both man and beast, even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness, they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord. I think that also goes along with what's going on with the prophet Ezekiel. He's in good terms. He knows he's all right, but he can't save all of these people.
Yeah, good. And if he steps wrong, I don't know in what way, but if he steps wrong, he's in danger too, right? Because he didn't say, and Ezekiel. He said, right, Daniel, Job, Noah. And he's like, well, I've been waiting like, hey, God, you left one out. Right? He didn't leave nobody out. Ezekiel's trouble,
Those other prophets aren't seeking to do God's will. They were seeking to do their own. I think about Pharaoh.
Yeah.
When all of not harden his heart. At a point, when God knows that you are no longer going to follow him, he will put you in your place. And you may not come back from that.
I was going to say, there's not always a comeback. Go ahead, I'm sorry, brother.
I forget the guy's name, the guy who raised Samuel, you know,
Eli.
Yeah, Eli's sons. Eli did good, but he didn't put his sons in check, and so he had to hold the punishment right along with his son. God removed him and his son.
You're bringing us back to where our brother was talking about, chapter 18, because that's a great illustration for, balancing out what we hear in chapter 18. We're not going to get done, but that's a class unto itself, because those are two passages I think really go well together, right? All right. What our brother said here. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Along with what Joel said, if you go back to chapter 13.
That's it. That's where we're going. Yeah, go ahead.
13 verse 2.
Go ahead.
The Son of Man prophesied against the prophets of Israel that prophesied, and stated unto them that prophesied out of their own hearts. So he's talking, these couple of chapters, he's talking about those prophets who prophesy out of their own hearts, not of God.
Okay. And a story that came to mind for me that hopefully gave me a little bit more clarity about the practical application for all of us, whether we're in the role of prophet or whatever or not. What got Balaam in trouble? Balaam and the donkey. Famous story from Yehi. Teach it downstairs.
He was going to take money.
What's that?
He was going to take money.
He was going to take money. But then, even when he went for the prophecies, he still said all the right things. I can only say what the Lord gives me to say. Yeah.
So why do you have his hand out for money?
Who knows? But there's a pretty good, man, I don't have enough time. All right. What got Balaam in trouble after he said all the right things? What got him in trouble? Was he a complete failure at cursing the people of Israel? He did get him. How did he get him? I can't tell the joke, but it's a classic mistake. If there was a playbook for making great men fall, it's if you can't get them with money, if you can't get them with drugs, if you can't get them with, send in the women, brother. That's all he did. He stopped trying to speak for God, and he's like, you know how you can get them? Right? They sent over the pretty girls. And eventually what happened was they started sinning because the women were able to get them to do things they otherwise would not have been willing to do. And so Balaam found a way to get his money, not by twisting God's words, but simply knowing that I know they're God's men, but they're still men. So maybe if you try this one, and sure enough, they were still men, right? And so here's the problem for Balaam, is there are times in life when even when we win, we lose. And what he's talking about here in chapter 14, chapters 13 and 14, is for the prophets, it's dangerous to hang around people who are going to continually ask you to do stuff that is just kind of testing the line of what God has told you need to stay away from. And so this, in my mind, is about boundaries. Because I can't tell you which prophets are clearly in danger here, because he doesn't give me a nice Ezekiel. You're with Noah and those guys. I'm not going to kill you. He doesn't give him a pass. He just says, any prophet that I deceive in this way, you're getting the bad news the bad way. All right? You're just going to find out when you start talking, and you realize that this was one of those people who had the... And here, what's the danger? Do you outwardly know that they have the idols? He says they have, in the first part of the chapter, where are the idols? They're in their heart. And so that's, once again, when we're talking about the difference between personality and character, you don't know who's coming through that door to ask for advice. But if you know the reputation of that individual is somebody who ain't all that interested in the things of God, you know this is a dangerous time to just be prophesying for anybody. And so you need your boundaries set in healthy places. And so as much as I want, we talk about it all the time, sometimes with money, but in life, as much as I want to help people, there are some times where I really need to know who you are. I need to know what you're about. Because these are dangerous times to be a prophet. These are dangerous times to be a fill in the blank. And that's why one of the reasons why once again in the New Testament, He's saying, I want my people to be as gentle as doves, but as wise as serpents. Having a good heart ain't good enough. In days like these, with the kind of lies that are spinning all the time, you better be very careful about going to God. Even David, a man after God's own heart. We talked about him. He was winning battle. Winning. One time he got in trouble was when you really think he's going to go inquire about God. God, should I go talk to Bathsheba? No, he knew he was doing wrong, right? But as long as he was in his normal routine, like you said, in battle, he knew, God, I need you. God, I need you. You think, man, if I had just killed Goliath, I'd be like, thanks, God, I got this one. That's why I'm not David. Right? David knew, I'm on a 10 fight win streak. God, this one don't look tough, but that's David's strength. He's not going off of appearances. Why? He's David. I don't look like much. Right? So I don't want to make the same mistake with him everybody makes with me. Everybody think this, I got that with Goliath. It's like, that's a win. Good luck with that. So David knows from experience what it's like to be overlooked, and he gets the lesson. I'm not going to make the same mistake they all make with me. Right? And so that's what we're seeing here. You have to ask God at every juncture in a society like this, like we're seeing, right? We just got our new iteration of the same thing. We have to, God willing, ask God to give us the discernment of who is it that we really need to be, even at best intentions, helping. Because we don't necessarily know what their motives actually are. And at the same time, my motives, God, why am I doing this? Right? Because it's awesome to say. That's one of these chapters. It's the decline, the rise and the decline of the nation. The great big old chapter 16, with 63 verses. You want to know why it's got 63 verses in it? Because it's going through their history in metaphors. From the time he's likening them to a discarded child in the wilderness. He's saying, I picked you up and I actually gave you life, right? I restored you to purpose. And once you had your purpose, you went buck wild. And he's talking about the rise and decline of a nation that he's about to raise again. And so that's one of the things. Over time. but with that, just discernment is so important right now. And staying plugged into God to help him. Ask him to help us understand. One, God willing, please give us the drive to still want to help people, right? Because that's why he created us. The short video, the last one made late today. Give us the desire to still, that's why he created us. Ephesians, after the popular verse that's often quoted for faith only and grace, my pet peeve again, grace, salvation, but we are his workmanship, chapter 2. Created, saved by grace through faith. Anyway, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works that he prepared beforehand that we should walk in. And part of the reason we are created is to do good works. I just ran them good works for our glory's sake, but there are people who are actually in need. But the wisdom is who really needs our help and for what reason, right? Once again, am I helping people who are going to be a blessing? Or am I setting people up on their feet so they just go terrorize other people with their second chance? Right? And so that's one of the things we have to think. What happens with this person once I help pick them up out of their situation? And who am I really helping? Who am I really helping? And God help me understand and do what's right. Anybody have any questions? Any questions? All right. God is able.